They said working at McDonald's wasn't glamorous, but they didn't warn me it could be deadly. The job at the McDonald's in Oak Ridge, Kentucky, was supposed to be my big break. After months of scraping by as a freelance graphic designer, jumping between gigs, and living paycheck to paycheck, I was ready for something stable. The promise of consistent hours and a steady income felt like a lifeline. Sure, it wasn't exactly a dream job, but I was grateful. And to be honest, I liked the idea of working nights. Fewer people to deal with, a quiet shift, just me, the hum of the fryers, and the occasional late-night drive-through customer. The Oak Ridge McDonald's wasn't much to look at. Nestled at the edge of town, surrounded by dense pine trees, it was far enough from everything to feel isolated. The parking lot was uneven, with cracks big enough to swallow a small dog, and the golden arches on the roof were faded, the once bright yellow now a dull mustard. Still, the place had a certain charm. Inside, everything was clean and well kept, the familiar smell of grease and French fries clinging to the air. During the day, it was a bustling hub of activity, filled with families, students, and truckers. At night, though, it was a different world entirely. My first shift started with a brief tour from Diane, the store manager. Diane was a tall, no-nonsense woman with graying hair pulled into a tight bun and a clipboard perpetually tucked under her arm. She walked me through the basics: how to handle the fry station, where the freezer was, how to log drive-through orders. Her voice was sharp, and she rarely made eye contact, but I figured that was just her style. As we walked through the kitchen, she glanced at her watch and frowned. "One more thing," she said, gesturing for me to follow her to the walk-in freezer. Inside, she pointed to a laminated sheet of paper taped to the wall. "Read this. Follow it. Don't ask questions." The rules were typed in bold letters, with 8 bullet points neatly listed. They seemed ridiculous at first. Rule number 1, fulfill every order, no matter how big or strange. Rule number 2, if a customer knocks on the locked front door after midnight, ignore it. Rule number 3, always keep the ice cream machine running, even if it breaks down. Rule number 4, never look into the playground tunnel after 3 a.m. Rule number 5, if you see a figure standing by the drive-through window but no car, turn off the headset immediately. Rule number 6, at 2:22 a.m., restock the ketchup dispensers, even if they're full. Rule number 7, if you hear knocking from inside the walk-in freezer, don't open it. Rule number 8, always mop the dining room floor at exactly 4 a.m. At the bottom, a line in italics read, follow the rules. Breaking them will endanger more than your job. I laughed nervously, expecting Diane to crack a smile or tell me it was some kind of initiation joke. She didn't. Instead, she clapped me on the shoulder, said, "Good luck," and left without another word. As I stood there, staring at the list, the cold of the freezer seemed to seep into my bones. A draft rustled the edges of the laminated paper, and for a moment, I thought I heard something, a faint scratching sound, like nails on metal. Shaking it off, I closed the freezer door behind me and returned to the kitchen. The rest of the night passed uneventfully. I stocked shelves, wiped counters, and learned the quirks of the kitchen equipment. The drive-through was quiet, with only a handful of customers trickling in. Around 11:30 p.m., the dining area lights dimmed slightly, giving the place an eerie, hollow feel. I chalked it up to my imagination and focused on keeping busy. At 12 a.m. sharp, the headset crackled to life with an incoming order. The voice was faint and distorted, almost like it was coming from an old radio. "I need 50 cheeseburgers. No pickles." I froze. That couldn't be right. I checked the monitor, and sure enough, the order was there, 50 cheeseburgers. I leaned out the drive-through window, expecting to see a car, but the lane was empty, bathed in the harsh glow of the fluorescent drive-through lights. "Hello?" I said into the headset. No response. The rule flashed in my mind, fulfill every order, no matter how big or strange. I sighed and got to work, assembling burger after burger. By the time I finished, I was drenched in sweat, my arms sore from reaching for condiments and patties. I bagged the order and set it on the counter by the drive-through window. When I turned back to grab something, the bag was gone. The monitor beeped again, signaling a completed order. The screen cleared, and my headset went silent. Okay, I muttered to myself. Weird, but fine. As I cleaned up, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. I glanced at the security cameras but saw nothing out of the ordinary, just the empty kitchen and the deserted parking lot. At 12:30 a.m., the knocking started. It was soft at first, just a gentle tap-tap on the glass of the front door. I froze, remembering rule number 2, if a customer knocks on the locked front door after midnight, ignore it. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I turned my back to the door, focusing on wiping down the counters, but the sound wouldn't stop. Each knock seemed to echo through the empty restaurant, bouncing off the tiled walls. Finally, the noise ceased. When I dared to glance at the door, my stomach dropped. The glass was fogged up as though someone had pressed their face against it. By the time my shift ended, the rules were no longer a joke. As I walked into my second shift, the laminated list of rules weighed heavy on my mind. I'd spent the day replaying the strange events of my first night over and over, trying to convince myself it was just nerves, or maybe an elaborate prank set up by my new coworkers. But I'd met no one else on my shift so far, not even a fleeting glimpse of another employee. Diane had mentioned something about low staffing, but the total isolation was starting to feel deliberate. The restaurant felt different this time. Even in the brightly lit kitchen, with the familiar smell of frying oil wafting through the air, there was an odd stillness. The hum of the machine sounded sharper, like they were straining under some unseen weight. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I found myself growing restless, my eyes darting toward the walk-in freezer where the rules were posted. I had already memorized them, every word burned into my brain, but the need to check them was like an itch I couldn't scratch. At 11:50 p.m., the drive-thru monitor beeped, breaking the silence. I glanced at it, half expecting another massive order like the previous night. Instead, it was a single burger, no modifications. Relieved by the simplicity, I prepared the order quickly and placed it by the window. But when I leaned out to hand it off, there was no car. The monitor chimed again, order complete. The bag of food was gone. Okay, I whispered to myself, trying to suppress the unease creeping up my spine. No big deal. By midnight, the quiet became oppressive. I kept busy by cleaning the fryer station, reorganizing the stockroom, and refilling the soda syrups. Still, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. I glanced at the clock. 12:15 a.m. It was then that the ice cream machine began to whir. I froze. No one had used it, and I'd certainly not turned it on. Yet the machine hummed to life, its arms spinning, dispensing a perfect swirl of soft serve into the empty catch tray below. The cone wobbled for a moment before toppling to the ground, its glossy white surface now tinged gray, as though the ice cream had been mixed with ash. The machine continued to run, spitting out cone after cone. The rule was clear, always keep the ice cream machine running, even if it breaks down. I stood there, watching as the cones piled higher, the machine's hum filling the air. It felt like a test, like the machine was waiting for me to turn it off, waiting to see if I would break the rule. My hands itched to press the power button, to stop the mess. But I didn't. Instead, I backed away, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. At 12:30 a.m., the knocking began again. This time, it was louder. The sound came in rapid bursts, echoing through the restaurant as though someone were pounding on the glass with their fists. I clenched my jaw, staring at the front door from across the kitchen. There was no way I was going to look directly at it. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind: if a customer knocks on the locked front door after midnight, ignore it. The pounding didn't let up. It grew more frantic, rattling the glass in its frame. My hands trembled as I gripped the counter. It wasn't just knocking anymore, it was accompanied by a low, guttural sound, like someone trying to choke back a scream. I stayed put, focusing on the fryer in front of me, determined to stick to the rules. My resolve nearly broke when the sound stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse. A voice. Andy. It came from the front door. The voice was soft, almost kind, but there was something off about it, like a recording played just slightly out of sync. Andy, I need your help. I clenched my fists, refusing to respond. Andy. This time, The voice was different. Familiar. It was my own voice. I spun around, but the front door was empty. No figure, no fogged glass. Just the faint, rhythmic beep of the fry timer pulling me back to reality. I turned off the fryer and leaned against the counter, wiping sweat from my brow. My heart felt like it was trying to beat its way out of my chest. The knocking didn't return, and neither did the voice, but the oppressive silence that followed was somehow worse. The rest of the night passed uneventfully, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the rules weren't just arbitrary guidelines, they were keeping something out, or maybe keeping it in. When my shift ended at 6 a.m., I stepped out into the parking lot, the cold morning air a welcome relief. I half expected to see some shadowy figure waiting for me by my car, but the lot was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me as I drove away. By the time I got home, I was exhausted but too wired to sleep. I kept glancing at my phone, expecting a call or text from Diane, but there was nothing. I thought about quitting, about calling her and saying I wasn't coming back. But a part of me, the stubborn, optimistic part, wanted to see it through. This was just a job. Rules or no rules, I could handle it. Couldn't I? The next evening, I walked into the McDonald's with a strange mix of determination and dread. My previous shift had left me rattled, but I convinced myself it was just exhaustion, an overactive imagination, or some elaborate prank. Yet, deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right about this place, or its rules. I arrived early, clocking in as Diane was finishing up paperwork in her office. She barely looked up as I passed by, muttering something about low staffing and long hours. I wanted to ask her more about the rules, about why they were there, but her distracted demeanor made me hesitate. Instead, I busied myself prepping for the night shift. The fryers were cleaned, the soda syrups restocked, and the floors mopped. Everything about the restaurant felt ordinary, almost boring, in the daylight. It wasn't until the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the parking lot, that the unease crept back in. By midnight, the atmosphere had shifted entirely. The hum of the machinery seemed louder, the lights harsher, and every small sound echoed as though the walls were closing in. I found myself glancing toward the walk-in freezer, where the rules were posted, as though the laminated sheet held answers I couldn't see. At 12:10 a.m., the drive-through monitor beeped. I stiffened, expecting another bizarre order or an empty car. Instead, it was a single cheeseburger, no modifications. Relieved by the simplicity, I prepared the order and approached the window. This time, there was a car. It was an old, rusted sedan, its headlights dim and the engine sputtering. A man sat in the driver's seat, his face obscured by shadows. As I handed over the bag, he didn't move to take it. "Here you go," I said, my voice cracking slightly. The man tilted his head, his movements slow and deliberate. I caught a glimpse of his face, a pale, gaunt visage with hollow eyes that didn't quite seem to focus on me. "Thank you," he said, his voice raspy and unnaturally deep. Then he drove off, the car disappearing into the darkness as though it had never been there. I closed the window, my hands shaking. "Just a customer," I whispered to myself. Nothing weird about that. But I didn't believe it. As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edge of my vision, and the air grew colder, the hum of the machinery almost deafening in its constancy. At 2:22 a.m., I remembered rule number 6, restock the ketchup dispensers, even if they're full. It seemed like such a pointless task, but I wasn't about to test what might happen if I skipped it. Grabbing the ketchup bottles from the stockroom, I made my way to the dining area. The dispensers were, of course, already full, but I dutifully replaced them with fresh bottles, feeling like an idiot the entire time. As I worked, I became aware of a faint noise, a soft, almost melodic laughter coming from the playground outside. My stomach dropped. Rule number 4, never look into the playground tunnel after 3 a.m. It wasn't 3 a.m. yet, but the sound unnerved me all the same. I finished restocking as quickly as I could and hurried back to the kitchen, trying to block out the laughter. The drive-through monitor beeped again. I froze, dread coiling in my stomach. Slowly, I turned to face the screen. No order. Just a blank screen. Is someone there? I called out, my voice trembling. The drive-through alert beeped again. Still no order. I approached the window cautiously, half expecting to see the rusted sedan or the shadowy figure from the night before. Instead, the window was empty. No car, no person. Just the empty parking lot, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. I shut the window quickly, locking it for good measure. For the next hour, I tried to keep busy, focusing on cleaning tasks and reorganizing the stockroom. But the tension in the air was palpable, and every creak or groan of the building made me jump. At 3:05 a.m., the laughter returned. It was louder this time, echoing from the playground just beyond the restaurant. Against my better judgment, I approached the window overlooking the play area, careful not to look directly at the tunnel. The playground looked normal at first glance, the colorful slides and climbing structures casting long shadows under the floodlights. But as I scanned the area, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The tunnel had moved. It was subtle, but the opening of the plastic tube slide seemed to be at a slightly different angle, as though it had shifted overnight. The laughter grew louder, accompanied by faint scratching sounds. I backed away from the window, my heart pounding. The rules had been clear: don't look into the tunnel after 3 a.m., and I wasn't about to break that one. Instead, I retreated to the stockroom, locking the door behind me. The laughter continued for another 20 minutes before fading into silence. By the time my shift ended at 6 a.m., I was exhausted and on edge. As I clocked out, I noticed a single ketchup packet sitting on the counter by the register. It hadn't been there before, and the faint scent of ketchup lingered in the air. I didn't touch it. When I stepped outside, the cold morning air felt like a slap to the face, a harsh reminder that the night was finally over. But as I walked to my car, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following night, I stepped into the McDonald's with a sense of foreboding that I couldn't quite shake. Everything in the restaurant looked the same as always: the bright fluorescents humming overhead, the faint scent of fryer grease in the air, and the steady hum of the machinery. Yet, it felt different. It wasn't just the rules, it was the way the space seemed to watch me, waiting for something to go wrong. I clocked in, running through my mental checklist for the night. The first few hours passed uneventfully, almost deceptively so. I restocked the napkin dispensers, wiped down the counters, and cleaned the soda machine. Each task was routine, but I couldn't help feeling like I was being lulled into a false sense of security. At 12:10 a.m., I stationed myself near the drive-thru, anticipating the nightly orders. Right on cue, the monitor beeped at 12:15 a.m. This time, the order was even stranger: 99 Happy Meals, all with chocolate milk. I didn't hesitate. Rule number 1 was clear: fulfill every order, no matter how odd. The kitchen felt colder as I prepared the meals, the fryer grease popping and hissing more aggressively than usual. By the time I finished bagging everything, the stack of Happy Meals seemed to tower ominously over me. When I brought the bags to the drive-thru window, my stomach dropped. There was no car. The space where the vehicle should have been was completely empty, just the dim parking lot stretching out into the night. The hair on my arm stood up as I opened the window, feeling a chill rush in. Despite the absence of a customer, I placed the bags onto the sill, stepping back as if someone might take them. The silence was deafening, but then, one by one, the bags disappeared. I didn't see a hand. I didn't hear footsteps. They just vanished, as though the night itself had swallowed them whole. I closed the window quickly, locking it as my hands trembled. The rest of the night was quiet, but not in a comforting way. The drive-thru monitor stayed off, and the kitchen seemed to hum with an almost malevolent energy. By the time my shift ended, I practically sprinted to my car, my eyes scanning the darkened parking lot for anything unusual. The next day, I told myself I was imagining things, that it was all just an elaborate joke or some glitch in the system. But when I returned to the restaurant for my shift, the unease returned almost immediately. At 2:22 a.m., I remembered rule number 6 and went to restock the ketchup dispensers. I felt silly carrying the extra bottles, knowing they were already full, but I wasn't about to test the consequences of ignoring the rules. As I approached the dining area, I froze. The mannequins in the seasonal department, which I'd never given much thought to before, were positioned differently. One stood directly in the middle of the dining room, its plastic face turned toward the kitchen. Its outstretched hand pointed to the walk-in freezer. I dropped the ketchup bottles, backing away instinctively. My rational mind tried to explain it. Maybe someone was pulling a prank, or maybe I'd just misremembered where the mannequins had been. But deep down, I knew better. I finished restocking the dispensers as quickly as I could, my hands shaking. When I turned to leave, the mannequin was gone. The next night was worse. At 3 a.m., I was cleaning the fryer when the drive-thru monitor beeped. My heart sank as I approached the window, dreading what I might see. This time, the monitor didn't display an order. Instead, it was filled with static, the faint outline of a shadow flickering across the screen. I turned off the headset immediately, following rule number 5. But the shadow didn't go away. It lingered on the screen, growing darker and more distinct. The faint outline of a figure began to take shape, a tall, gaunt silhouette with unnaturally long limbs. The monitor buzzed loudly before going completely black, plunging the drive-thru area into an eerie silence. The urge to leave was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay. I knew better than to break the rules, no matter how terrified I felt. At 3:05 a.m., I heard the laughter again. This time, it wasn't coming from the playground, it was inside the restaurant. The sound echoed faintly through the dining area, a soft, childlike giggle that sent chills down my spine. I gripped the counter for support, my legs trembling as I forced myself to breathe. The laughter grew louder, accompanied by the faint sound of footsteps. They were light, almost playful, but there was something deeply unsettling about them. I stayed rooted to the spot, refusing to investigate. When the sound stopped, I cautiously made my way to the dining area to check. Everything looked normal at first glance. The tables and chairs were in their usual places, and the floor was clean. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. A single red balloon was tied to one of the chairs. It hadn't been there before. I backed away slowly, my heart pounding. The balloon bobbed slightly, as if pulled by an invisible hand. When I reached the kitchen, I locked the door behind me, vowing not to leave until my shift ended. The rest of the night passed in a blur of paranoia and fear. Every sound, every flicker of movement, felt like a threat. By the time the morning crew arrived, I was a wreck. Diane greeted me with her usual cheeriness, but I noticed her eyes lingered on me a moment longer than usual. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone light but probing. "Fine," I lied, forcing a smile. She didn't press further, but as I left the building, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. One of the mannequins was standing by the playground, its plastic face turned toward me. The following shift, I arrived at McDonald's determined to maintain a sense of normalcy. Whatever had been happening, I rationalized that it couldn't hurt me as long as I followed the rules. Diane had even made a passing comment during our last conversation about how every store has its quirks. Maybe this was just Pine Hollow's version of an initiation prank. Still, the unease lingered. I parked my car under the single functioning light in the parking lot, noting the way the shadows of the forest seemed to press closer than usual. My footsteps echoed eerily as I approached the back entrance of the restaurant, the soft hum of the ice machine in the distance doing little to calm my nerves. Inside, everything appeared routine. The fryers sizzled faintly, the overhead lights buzzed, and the faint scent of grease hung in the air. But it wasn't routine. I could feel it. I began my shift as usual, stocking cups and lids, cleaning the soda machine, and organizing the condiments. As I worked, I avoided looking too long at the seasonal aisle, where the mannequins had made their unsettling movements in previous nights. I could feel their presence even though they were out of sight, as if they were watching me, waiting for the right moment to catch me off guard. At 12 a.m. sharp, the drive-thru monitor beeped. My heart clenched, but I kept my face calm as I approached. The order was simple this time: 2 cheeseburgers and a large fries. I prepared the meal quickly, grateful for the normalcy of the request. But when I opened the window, I froze. There was no car, but unlike the previous nights, this time there was something, or someone. A man stood just beyond the window's reach, his face hidden beneath the brim of a black hood. His posture was unnervingly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. I couldn't see his eyes, but I felt their weight on me, heavy and intrusive. I placed the bag on the sill and stepped back. "Here you go," I said, my voice trembling slightly. The man didn't move. "Your food's ready," I repeated, trying to sound firm. He raised one hand slowly, his pale fingers wrapping around the edge of the bag. The movement was deliberate, almost mechanical. As he pulled the bag toward him, I caught a glimpse of his face beneath the hood, a smooth, featureless expanse where his mouth should have been. The window slammed shut on its own. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing. The drive-through monitor went dark, leaving me alone in the oppressive silence of the kitchen. I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that I hadn't broken any rules. Rule number 1 was clear: fulfill every order, no matter how strange. And I had done just that. The rest of the night passed in fits and starts, each task feeling like a monumental effort as my nerves frayed further. At 2:22 a.m., the next rule came into play: restocking the ketchup dispensers. My hands trembled as I carried the box of bottles to the dining area, the red glow of the security cameras casting long shadows across the floor. I moved quickly, my eyes darting toward the playground, where I swore I saw something shift in the darkness. As I finished refilling the dispensers, I heard a faint scraping sound behind me. I froze, my body tense as the noise grew louder, like nails dragging across the tiled floor. Slowly, I turned my head. One of the mannequins was standing in the center of the dining area, its plastic hand outstretched as if beckoning me. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding. The mannequin didn't move, but its presence felt suffocating. I clung to the rules like a lifeline, knowing that as long as I didn't break them, I would be safe. I left the dining area as quickly as I could, locking myself in the kitchen. The minutes dragged on, each second feeling like an eternity as I waited for the shift to end. At 3 a.m., the toy aisle's faint melody began to play. The sound was distant at first, a soft, tinkling tune that sent chills down my spine. It grew louder, filling the restaurant with an unnatural cheerfulness that felt entirely out of place. I remembered rule number 8: if you hear the toy aisle music after 3 a.m., clock out immediately and leave the building. I didn't hesitate. Grabbing my things, I clocked out and headed for the back door, my footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. As I reached the exit, I glanced back one last time. The mannequins were all lined up by the playground, their plastic faces turned toward me. I stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a wave. The music faded as I walked to my car, but the sense of being watched never left me. I could feel their unblinking gazes following me as I drove away, the shadows of the forest pressing closer with each passing mile. By the time I reached home, I was physically and emotionally drained. Collapsing onto my couch, I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, a combination of exhaustion and paranoia. But deep down, I knew better. The rules weren't just there for show. They were the only thing keeping me alive. The next night, I arrived at the McDonald's earlier than usual, hoping the extra time would help me mentally prepare for whatever was coming. The creeping unease from the previous nights lingered, settling into my bones like a cold chill. Yet, I reminded myself that I hadn't broken a single rule. The thought brought some comfort. Inside, the restaurant seemed deceptively normal. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly, and the fryer gurgled in the background. I could almost pretend the past few shifts hadn't happened, almost. My eyes darted toward the playground outside, where the curved plastic tunnel loomed in the darkness. Even in the daylight, it gave off a sinister air. I spent the first part of the shift focusing on tasks that kept my mind busy, scrubbing the counters, organizing the stockroom, and wiping down the soda machine. But as the clock neared midnight, my anxiety returned. At exactly 12 a.m., the drive-through alert beeped. My heart jumped, but I forced myself to stay calm. I approached the monitor, expecting something unusual, but the order was mundane: a Big Mac, fries, and a soda. I moved quickly, assembling the order and bagging it neatly. As I approached the window, I braced myself for the worst. This time, there was a car, an old, beat-up sedan idling by the window. The driver's face was obscured by shadows, but I could make out a faint outline of someone wearing a wide-brimmed hat. I placed the bag on the sill, careful not to let my hand linger too long. The driver reached out slowly, their gloved hand trembling slightly as they took the bag. For a moment, I thought I saw something move in the back seat, something too large to be a person. The driver pulled away without a word, leaving behind a faint trail of mist. I stood there for a moment, staring into the night, before snapping myself out of it and returning to the kitchen. The rest of the shift passed uneventfully until 2:22 a.m. arrived. This time, the ketchup dispensers were nearly empty, so restocking felt less absurd. I carried the box of bottles to the dining area, keeping my back to the playground. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. My eyes darted toward the windows, but the shadows outside remained still. Then, just as I finished, I heard it, a faint knock from the walk-in freezer. My stomach twisted into knots. Rule number 7 echoed in my mind: if you hear knocking from inside the walk-in freezer, don't open it. The knock came again, louder this time. It wasn't a frantic pounding but a steady, deliberate tap. I stepped back, my hands trembling as I tried to focus on my breathing. The knocking stopped. For a brief moment, I thought it was over, but then came the voice. "Andy." The sound was muffled, as if someone was speaking through layers of ice and steel. It was my name, clear as day, and spoken in a voice that sounded exactly like mine. "Andy, help me." Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my feet refused to move. The voice called out again, more insistent this time. "It's so cold in here, please." I turned and sprinted out of the dining area, slamming the kitchen door behind me. My hands shook as I fumbled with the lock, ensuring it was secure. I stood there, panting, as the freezer's muffled pleas faded into silence. For the rest of the night, I avoided the freezer entirely. Even as the hum of the ice machine grew louder, and the faint sound of whispers echoed through the kitchen, I stayed in the main prep area, clinging to the rules like a lifeline. At 3 a.m., the toy aisle music started again. The familiar, warped melody filled the restaurant, louder and more distorted than before. It wasn't just a song, it was layered with faint whispers and a rhythmic thumping that reminded me of footsteps. I clocked out without hesitation, leaving my tasks unfinished. As I stepped into the parking lot, I glanced back at the restaurant. The playground tunnel glowed faintly, the light coming from within. I drove home in silence, the shadows of the forest pressing against the edges of my vision. Every so often, I thought I saw movement in the trees, glimpses of figures darting between the trunks. When I arrived at my apartment, I locked the door behind me and collapsed onto the couch. My thoughts raced, replaying the events of the night over and over. The voice in the freezer, the glowing tunnel, the figure at the drive-thru, it all felt too surreal, too impossible to be real. And yet, it was. Before going to bed, I checked my uniform for any stray ketchup stains or grease spots. As I folded the shirt, something fell from the pocket, a single ketchup packet. I stared at it, my mind racing. I was certain I hadn't put it there. Then I noticed the faint handwriting on the packet. The letters were small and jagged, as if scratched into the plastic with a sharp object. "Come back." I dropped the packet and backed away, my chest tightening. The room felt colder, the shadows longer. I grabbed my phone and considered calling Diane, but what could I even say? For the first time since I started this job, I wondered if I had made a mistake by following the rules. When I arrived for my final scheduled shift, the air felt heavier than usual, like the universe itself knew something terrible was about to happen. The parking lot was eerily empty, even for this hour, with only a faint layer of fog rolling across the cracked asphalt. I stared at the glowing golden arches for a long moment, trying to muster the courage to go inside. The door creaked louder than usual as I stepped in. The fluorescent lights hummed, their brightness making the shadows deeper by contrast. I walked past the empty dining area, where the plastic seats gleamed like polished tombstones, and into the kitchen. As always, I checked the rules taped inside the freezer door, though I had them memorized by now. There was something reassuring about seeing them there, as if they could protect me from whatever was lurking. I set my phone timer for 12 a.m., preparing for the ritual I knew would come. Just as the timer buzzed, the drive-thru alert beeped. My pulse quickened as I walked to the headset station, expecting another bizarre order or phantom presence. This time, there was no order. Just static, crackling faintly in my ear. "Hello?" I said hesitantly, even though I knew I wouldn't get a response. The static cleared slightly, and for a brief moment, I thought I heard someone whisper my name. My fingers hovered over the switch, debating whether to turn it off, but the static disappeared entirely before I could act. I turned to check the monitors. The camera feed for the drive-through lane flickered. A shadow passed across the screen, too fast to make out any details. I stared at the feed, waiting for something to happen, but the lane remained empty. Then the freezer knocked. The sound jolted me. It was louder this time, more insistent, like whoever, or whatever, was inside was desperate to get out. I glanced at the freezer door, half expecting to see it burst open, but it stayed firmly shut. "Andy." There it was again. My voice, calling to me from inside the freezer. I stepped back instinctively, my heart pounding. "Andy, please, help me." I gritted my teeth and forced myself to look away. The rules had kept me alive this long, and I wasn't about to break them now. Instead, I focused on the tasks ahead, using the motions of flipping burgers and prepping fries to distract myself. But even as I worked, I could feel the freezer's presence behind me, like a gaping mouth waiting to swallow me whole. At 2:22 a.m., I stocked the ketchup dispensers as usual, though my hands trembled. The act felt absurd, like trying to maintain normalcy in the middle of a nightmare. Just as I finished, the drive-through alert beeped again. My stomach sank. The camera feed showed nothing. No car, no shadow, just the empty lane. I flipped the switch on the headset anyway, bracing myself. "Welcome to McDonald's," I said, my voice strained. Static crackled, followed by a faint laugh, low and guttural, like it was coming from deep within the earth. I ripped the headset off and slammed it onto the counter. The laughter didn't stop. It echoed through the restaurant, filling every corner with its sinister tone. I backed away, my hands searching for something solid to hold on to. The sound grew louder, blending with the hum of the fluorescent lights and the whir of the ice cream machine. Then it stopped. Silence filled the air, heavy and oppressive. I turned toward the playground window, half expecting to see something staring back at me. Instead, I saw the tunnel, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. I looked away, reminding myself of rule number 4, never look into the playground tunnel after 3 a.m. The clock ticked closer to 3 a.m., and I began to clean up the kitchen, trying to keep my mind occupied. But every sound, the clatter of a spatula, the hiss of the fryer, felt amplified, each one echoing like a gunshot. Then, just as the clock struck 3, the toy aisle music began. It was louder this time, distorted and warped, as if played on a record that was melting. I froze, the mop handle clenched in my hand, and stared at the hallway leading to the playground. Something moved in the shadows. A figure emerged, pale and featureless, its elongated limbs stretching unnaturally as it crawled toward the kitchen. I dropped the mop and ran. The dining area felt endless as I sprinted toward the exit. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my heart pounded so hard it drowned out every other sound. The figure's distorted movements followed me, its body twisting in ways that shouldn't have been possible. When I reached the door, I fumbled with the lock, my hands slick with sweat. I didn't dare look back, but I could feel it getting closer. Finally, the lock clicked open, and I stumbled into the parking lot. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I kept running, not stopping until I reached my car. I glanced back at the restaurant, half expecting to see the figure at the window. But the dining area was empty. As I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still following me, lurking just beyond the edge of my headlights. When I got home, I locked every door and window and collapsed onto the couch. The room felt too quiet, like the world was holding its breath. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. "You followed the rules. Good job." My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. Then another message appeared. "But it's not over yet.